In the heart of North Carolina, carved into dense pine forests and sandy plains, lies a place that has witnessed more American military history than virtually any other piece of land on the continent. Spanning over 63,000 hectares, an area larger than many American cities, lies what was once known as Fort Bragg, recently renamed Fort Liberty. This is not just another military outpost. This is the largest military installation in the United States, a veritable empire within a nation, where more than 50,000 active soldiers call home, and where the echoes of a century of conflict, triumphs, tragedies, and secrets still reverberate through the command corridors and training grounds. The history of this base is inseparable from the history of modern American warfare. From its founding amidst the battlefields of World War I to its evolution as the epicenter of the world's most highly classified special forces operations, Fort Bragg embodies both the glory and the shadows of United States military might. Here, soldiers were forged in the fire of the most rigorous training. Here, missions that changed the course of world history were planned in secret rooms. But here, too, inexplicable tragedies have tarnished the reputation of this installation, raising disturbing questions about what truly happens when so much power, so much secrecy, and so many combat-trained professionals are concentrated in one place. This is the untold story of Fort Bragg, a journey through a century of blood, honor, conspiracy, and sacrifice. A deep dive into the corridors of military power where the lines between heroism and tragedy often blur. Prepare to uncover uncomfortable truths, unsolved mysteries, and the complex reality of a military installation that, in many ways, defines the very character of the modern American superpower. Before we delve into this in-depth investigation, if you enjoy detailed documentaries and untold stories, subscribe to the channel now, and leave a comment with the time you're watching this video. Let's begin. Our story begins in 1918, when the world was plunged into the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. World War I was redefining the nature of warfare, and the United States, newly entered into the conflict, realized with alarming urgency that it was unprepared. The American Army desperately needed large-scale training facilities to transform civilians into soldiers capable of facing the bloody trenches of Europe. It was in this context of urgent need that the federal government turned its attention to the vast sandy plains and pine forests of North Carolina. The region, known as the Sandhills, offered something precious: space. Miles and miles of relatively cheap and sparsely populated land, perfect for large-scale artillery exercises. North Carolina's temperate climate allowed for year-round training, a crucial advantage over northern facilities that froze during the winter. In September of 1918, the War Department leased over 50,000 hectares of land, displacing hundreds of rural families, many of whom had lived on that land for generations. Their small farms, their wooden chapels, their family cemeteries, all would be swallowed up by the insatiable appetite of the nascent military-industrial complex. This would be only the first of many sacrifices that land would witness. The base was officially established as Camp Bragg, named after Confederate General Braxton Bragg, a Southern commander in the Civil War. The choice of this name was not accidental. In 1918, just 5 decades after the end of the Civil War, racial segregation was law in the South, and the American Army was deeply segregated. Naming the base after a Confederate general was a political concession to the white South, a way to soften the federal impact on the region. This initial decision to appease Southern racism would cast a long shadow over the base, a shadow that would not be fully confronted until more than a century later. Camp Bragg began as a field artillery training facility. Thousands of recruits arrived by train from all over the country, young men who had never held a weapon, never known military discipline, never imagined they would face combat on foreign soil defending ideals they barely understood. Here they learned to fire cannons, to dig trenches, to survive the poison gas that had become the hallmark of the horrors of the First World War. But the war ended before many of these men could be sent to Europe. The armistice of November 1918 seemed to render these vast training facilities obsolete. Camp Bragg, like many American military bases, faced an uncertain future. In a time of peace, who would need so many bases, so much training, so many soldiers? The response came quickly. The American military, having now tasted global power, was unwilling to return to pre-war insignificance. Camp Bragg was permanently established in 1919, and in 1922 it was elevated to permanent installation status, officially becoming Fort Bragg. The field artillery had found its permanent home. During the 1920s and 1930s, while America enjoyed the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties and then suffered through the Great Depression, Fort Bragg remained, growing quietly, expanding, becoming a small city of its own. Barracks were built, roads paved, military families began to establish communities around the base. What had been farms and forests was transforming into something entirely different, a military landscape where the singular purpose was to prepare men for combat. The real transformation, however, was only beginning, and it would come with another war, an even greater war, a war that would test the limits of human endurance and morality. When Adolf Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, starting World War II, America still clung to the illusion of isolationism. But the military, learning from the lack of preparedness of World War I, was already preparing. And Fort Bragg was about to undergo a transformation that would make it truly legendary. In 1941, even before Pearl Harbor officially dragged the United States into the war, Fort Bragg was chosen as the training ground for a revolutionary new military formation, the Airborne Division. This was a radical idea, almost suicidal in the opinion of many. Men would jump from perfectly functional planes behind enemy lines, armed only with what they could carry, to cause chaos and prepare the way for conventional forces. It seemed like madness, but it was the kind of madness that could change the course of wars. The 82nd Airborne Division, the famous All-Americans, made Fort Bragg its home. It would soon be followed by the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Thousands of men arrived daily, climbing into uncomfortable planes, leaping into the skies of North Carolina, learning to fall, to roll, to survive the impact when their bodies hit the ground. The training was dangerous. Accidents happened, parachutes that didn't open, mid-air collisions, problematic landings. But the military machine didn't stop. There was a war to win. The base exploded in size. From a few thousand soldiers before the war, Fort Bragg now housed over 100,000 men. Entire cities of tents and temporary barracks sprouted from the sandy ground. The civilian population around the base also exploded. Fayetteville, the neighboring city, transformed almost overnight from a sleepy southern town into a bustling city, full of commercial establishments and all the challenges that accompany massive concentrations of young soldiers. The paratroopers trained at Fort Bragg would jump over Normandy on D-Day, facing devastating anti-aircraft fire, landing scattered across the French combat zone. Many falling in the wrong places, alone, separated from their units, but fighting nonetheless. They would jump over Holland in the disastrous Operation Market Garden. They would heroically defend Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, surrounded by overwhelming German forces, freezing in the brutal winter, but refusing to surrender. American military history was being written with the blood of men trained at this North Carolina base. But Fort Bragg wasn't just about heroism and glory. During World War II, the base was also deeply marked by racial segregation. Black soldiers trained in separate units, slept in separate barracks, and ate in separate mess halls. They were considered good enough to die for America, but not good enough to train alongside white soldiers. This moral hypocrisy, this fundamental contradiction between American ideals of freedom and the brutal reality of institutional racism, was evident in every aspect of life at Fort Bragg. Black soldiers faced not only discrimination within the base, but also violence from the surrounding white civilian community. Fayetteville, like many southern cities, was governed by Jim Crow laws. Black soldiers who had risked their lives overseas returned home only to be beaten, humiliated, and treated as second-class citizens in their own land. And Fort Bragg, despite being a federal installation, did little to protect its own black soldiers from this systemic violence. When the war ended in 1945, Fort Bragg could have returned to obscurity. But the world had changed irrevocably. America had emerged from the war as a global superpower, locked in an escalating Cold War with the Soviet Union. Peace, it turned out, required a state of permanent war, constant preparedness, eternal vigilance. Fort Bragg would not only survive, but thrive in this new era of endless conflict. And it was about to become something even more significant, something darker, something that would transform it into the beating heart of America's most secret and controversial military operations. In 1952, while the Korean War ravaged the Asian peninsula and fear of communism reached hysterical proportions in America, a new unit was created that would forever change the character of Fort Bragg. The 10th Special Forces Group, the first of its kind, was established to conduct unconventional warfare, covert operations, counterinsurgency, and all sorts of missions that the regular army could not or would not publicly claim. These were no conventional troops. The Green Berets, as they would become known, were recruited for their intelligence, linguistic skills, ability to think independently, and willingness to operate in the shadows of modern warfare. They would be sent to remote jungles, inhospitable deserts, and cities in civil war to train allies, conduct covert operations, and carry out sensitive missions that a democracy would prefer not to publicly acknowledge. Fort Bragg became home to the Army Special Forces. The base that had trained paratroopers to jump over Nazi Europe now trained shadow warriors to fight secret wars. And with this change came a new level of secrecy, a new layer of mystery that would shroud the base in rumors, speculation, and conspiracy theories that persist to this day. During the Vietnam War, Fort Bragg operated at full capacity. Tens of thousands of soldiers passed through the base, many destined for the jungles of Southeast Asia, where they would face an elusive enemy, a hostile population, and a war that could not be won with conventional firepower. Green Berets operated deep in Laos and Cambodia, on missions that officially never took place, in countries where we were officially not at war. Soldiers returned from tours in Vietnam deeply traumatized, carrying psychological demons that America was only beginning to comprehend. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a widely recognized diagnosis. Soldiers returning from the war with flashbacks, nightmares, and uncontrollable anger were often dismissed as weak, as inadequate, as problems to be hidden, not helped. Fort Bragg, like many military bases, lacked the infrastructure or the will to adequately address the psychological consequences of modern warfare. The military culture at Fort Bragg during these years was harsh, demanding, and focused on resilience. Soldiers were trained to be effective combatants, to maintain emotional control, and to develop rigorous discipline. Substance abuse was a growing problem. Drug use, although officially prohibited, was common, especially among Vietnam veterans trying to cope with their trauma. Domestic violence in the military communities surrounding the base was increasing, but it was rarely reported, rarely taken seriously. In 1979, a new unit arrived at Fort Bragg that would raise the base's profile to unprecedented heights. Delta Force, officially known as the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, was created as the Army's elite counterterrorism unit. Modeled after the British SAS, Delta Force operated in absolute secrecy, conducting hostage rescue missions, counterterrorism strikes, and counterterrorism operations worldwide. Fort Bragg now housed not only the largest concentration of airborne troops in the world, but also America's most secretive and lethal special forces. Entire sections of the base were off-limits even to regular military personnel. Training facilities were hidden behind double fences and no photography signs. Planes arrived and departed at night, carrying operators for missions that would never be recognized. Fort Bragg was becoming a black hole of military secrecy, a place where the distinction between legal and illegal, moral and immoral, often disappeared under the weight of national security. With so much secrecy, with so many highly trained operators concentrated in one place, it was only a matter of time before something went terribly wrong. In February of 1970, something happened at Fort Bragg that would shock the nation and cast a permanent shadow over the base. Captain Jeffrey McDonald, an Army surgeon and Green Beret medic, called emergency services reporting that his family had been attacked in their home on the base. His pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were found dead. McDonald claimed that intruders broke into his home, shouting slogans echoing the Manson case that had terrorized the nation just months earlier. The story immediately seemed strange. The investigation revealed disturbing inconsistencies. The crime scene had clearly been manipulated. McDonald's injuries were superficial, while his family had been attacked with extreme violence. The physical evidence completely contradicted his narrative. But MacDonald was a respected Army officer, a doctor, a man with no history of violence. How could this be possible? The Army initially did not indict him, claiming a lack of sufficient evidence. But the investigation continued. 9 years later, in 1979, Jeffrey MacDonald was finally convicted of the crimes against his family. He still professes his innocence, and the case still attracts conspiracy theorists who believe he was framed. But the overwhelming majority of evidence points to a disturbing truth. An Army officer trained at Fort Bragg was responsible for the death of his own family. This would not be an isolated case. Fort Bragg would develop a grim reputation for disturbing crimes. The concentration of combat-trained men, many dealing with untreated trauma, combined with easy access to weapons and a culture that often excused or ignored warning signs, created an environment where tragedies were almost inevitable. In 2002, Fort Bragg once again made national headlines, this time for a disturbing series of domestic violence cases. In a period of just 6 weeks, four soldiers' wives lost their lives in incidents involving their husbands, all recent veterans of Afghanistan. The crimes were serious, committed by men trained in combat. 3 of those responsible took their own lives after the incidents. 1 survived to face trial. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. All the men had exhibited signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. All had changed dramatically after returning from combat. All had sought or been encouraged to seek help, but the military mental health system was overburdened, underfunded, and inadequate for the volume of traumatized soldiers returning from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Army was forced to confront uncomfortable questions. Were we adequately preparing soldiers for the transition back to civilian life? Were we training men to be effective combatants without giving them adequate tools to process the trauma upon returning home? Was the military culture of stoicism and strength, which discouraged soldiers from admitting weakness or seeking help, contributing to these tragedies? The reforms promised after 2002 were only partially implemented. Funding for mental health increased, but never enough. Screening programs were introduced, but many soldiers learned to deceive them, to tell the authorities what they wanted to hear, knowing that admitting problems could end their careers. And the incidents continued. Assaults, domestic violence, the rates in Fort Bragg consistently exceeded national averages. Some attributed this simply to demographics. A concentration of young people, predominantly men in their 20s, will always have higher crime rates. But others saw something more sinister, a toxicity embedded in the very culture of the base. Besides the proven crimes, Fort Bragg has accumulated a collection of unsolved mysteries that fuel conspiracy theories to this day. In 1987, a soldier named James Riley disappeared from the base. His body was never found. Rumors circulated that he had witnessed something he shouldn't have, something related to classified operations, and was silenced. No concrete evidence ever surfaced, but the mystery remains. In 1990, another soldier, William Bynum, was found dead in the base's training areas under circumstances that the Army quickly classified as accidental. His family disputed this conclusion, pointing to forensic inconsistencies. They believed there was more to the story. The case was closed, but the questions were never fully answered. More recently, in 2020, a wave of tragic incidents swept through Fort Bragg. Over 30 soldiers died at the base throughout the year, in circumstances ranging from car accidents to apparent overdoses to unexplained cases. Some of the deaths seemed genuinely accidental. Others raised disturbing questions. Families demanded answers that the Army seemed reluctant or unable to provide. The truth likely lies somewhere between elaborate conspiracies and mundane explanations. Fort Bragg is enormous, with tens of thousands of soldiers. Statistically, deaths and crimes will occur. But the sheer volume, the violent nature of many incidents, and the veil of secrecy surrounding Special Forces operations creates fertile ground for suspicion, for doubt, for the persistent feeling that truths are being hidden. To understand Fort Bragg, to truly grasp the nature of this base, we need to confront the role it plays in America's most secretive and morally ambiguous operations. Because Fort Bragg is not just a training base. It is the launching pad for shadowy wars fought in countries most Americans can't locate on a map, against enemies the government rarely acknowledges publicly. The Intelligence Support Activity, a generic and deliberately vague name for a unit that conducts covert surveillance, human reconnaissance, and operations bordering on espionage, operates from Fort Bragg. Delta Force launches attacks that never make the news. Green Berets train guerrillas in countries where we officially have no military presence. All this apparatus of covert warfare, of unrecognized operations, of violence that takes place far from the public eye and democratic accountability, is coordinated, planned, and launched from Fort Bragg. Following the September 11th attacks, Fort Bragg became the epicenter of the war on terror. Special Forces operators continually deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, West Africa, and countless other locations. They conducted nighttime operations, capturing suspected terrorists and neutralizing threats. They operated under rules of engagement that were often vague, in situations where distinguishing combatants from civilians was nearly impossible. Some of these operations were genuine successes, disrupting terrorist plots and capturing leaders of extremist organizations. Others were tragic disasters, resulting in innocent civilian casualties, including innocent victims in attacks based on flawed intelligence, and families affected because someone misidentified a target. And the operators who conducted these missions returned to Fort Bragg carrying the moral weight of their actions. Some managed to compartmentalize, to separate the work they did overseas from their lives at home. Others could not. The demons they brought back consumed them, manifesting as addictions, violence, and psychological disintegration. The Army tried to implement support programs, but there was always a fundamental contradiction. How do you train someone to be a highly effective combatant, to operate in extremely dangerous situations, and then expect him to come home and be a loving husband, a patient father, a normal member of society? How do you make that transition? Fort Bragg was also at the center of controversies regarding the treatment of prisoners. Interrogators trained at the base were sent to Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, and CIA facilities around the world. Some of these interrogators crossed legal and moral lines, engaging in techniques that most of the world considers questionable. When these practices became public, tarnishing the reputation of the United States globally, investigations attempted to trace who had authorized these techniques, who had trained the interrogators, and what the chain of command was. The trails often led back to Fort Bragg, but rarely beyond. The secrecy surrounding Special Forces operations made accountability nearly impossible. Documents were classified. Witnesses refused to speak, citing national security. Senior officers pleaded plausible ignorance. The truth remained buried beneath layers of classification and denial. This secrecy creates its own set of problems. Without proper external oversight, without transparency, without public accountability, how do we know what is really happening behind the security fences of Fort Bragg? How do we know that the operations conducted on our behalf are aligned with our values, our laws, our constitutional commitments? The uncomfortable answer is that we often don't know. We trust that the military is acting with integrity, that the internal checks and balances are sufficient. But history has taught us repeatedly that this trust is often misplaced, that without external oversight, powerful institutions tend to abuse power, cut moral shortcuts, and prioritize effectiveness over ethics. And Fort Bragg, as the heart of America's most secret operations, embodies these tensions. It is simultaneously essential to our national security and potentially dangerous to our democratic values. It is both our sword and an ever-present risk that this sword will cut in directions we did not intend. For more than a century, this base bore the name of Braxton Bragg, a Confederate general whose loyalty was to the cause of slavery and whose military ability was, at best, mediocre. For more than a century, black soldiers served at a base named after a man who fought to keep them enslaved. This grotesque contradiction was ignored, rationalized, defended by generations of military leaders who argued that tradition and continuity outweighed historical offenses. But after the death of George Floyd in 2020 and the massive protests for racial justice that swept the nation, the pressure to confront symbols of white supremacy became irresistible. A commission was formed to review the names of military bases that honored Confederate leaders. Fort Bragg was at the top of the list. In 2023, after decades of resistance, after countless arguments that changing the name would erase history or disrespect the soldiers who served under the old name, Fort Bragg officially became Fort Liberty. The new name was chosen to represent the ideals for which American soldiers supposedly fight: freedom, democracy, human rights. The change was controversial. Some applauded it as long overdue, a necessary acknowledgement that honoring Confederate generals was incompatible with an army that now prides itself on its diversity. Others denounced it as historical erasure, as capitulation to leftist activism, as a betrayal of Southern heritage. But changing the name doesn't alter history. It doesn't erase the crimes committed within these walls. It doesn't resurrect the dead, doesn't heal the traumatized, doesn't answer the unresolved questions that haunt this base. It's a symbolic gesture, important to some, insignificant to others, but ultimately just a new label on a place whose essence remains unchanged. Because Fort Liberty, like Fort Bragg before it, is still the heart of the American military-industrial complex. It is still where warriors are trained to conduct the organized violence of the state. It is still shrouded in secrecy, still haunted by mysteries, still marked by contradictions between the ideals we profess and the realities of military power. And while we focus on arguments over names, deeper questions remain unanswered. How do we reconcile our reliance on military force with our commitments to human rights? How do we hold covert operations accountable in a democracy that demands transparency? How do we care for the soldiers we train for combat when they return home carrying the psychological weight of their experiences? How do we ensure that the enormous power concentrated in places like Fort Liberty is used only for just and defensive purposes? These are questions that don't have easy answers. They are tensions inherent to any nation that maintains a powerful military apparatus while declaring itself committed to peace and democracy. Here, at the largest American military base, amidst training grounds where paratroopers still leap from the sky, where special forces operators practice in specialized facilities, where helicopters thunder over pine forests, we find a microcosm of America itself. Its glories and its shames, its triumphs and its tragedies, its lofty aspirations and its human failings. Fort Liberty is not just a military base. It is a monument to the moral complexity of power, a reminder that every act of heroism carries within it the potential shadow of unintended consequences. The same men trained to defend our country can, under the wrong circumstances, face serious emotional and psychological challenges. The same skills that free hostages also carry moral weight. The same institution that produced decorated heroes has also had to confront instances of misconduct. More than 100 years after this land was first claimed by the military, more than a century of blood, sweat, and sacrifice, the fundamental questions about Fort Liberty remain. Are we doing enough to care for the warriors we train? Are we exercising adequate oversight over the covert operations conducted in our name? Are we being honest with ourselves about the moral and psychological costs of maintaining a global military presence through force? Or are we, as we have been for so long, simply wrapped in flags, thanking our soldiers for their service, and refusing to look too closely at the uncomfortable realities that exist within the gates of our military bases? The history of Fort Liberty is the history of America. It is a story of extraordinary courage and human failings, of selfless sacrifice and grave errors, of inspiring ideals and complex realities. It is a story that continues to be written, with every soldier who passes through its gates, with every mission launched from its airfields, with every decision made in its command centers. And perhaps, just perhaps, by confronting this history honestly, in all its complexity and contradiction, we can begin to ask the difficult questions that will lead us to a future where military power genuinely serves justice, where warriors are honored not only when they actively serve, but properly cared for when they return, where secrecy does not become an excuse to avoid responsibility. Fort Liberty will remain. Soldiers will continue to train. Missions will continue to be launched. But what kind of base it will be, what kind of operations it will conduct, what kind of legacy it will leave, depends on our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and demand that our military institutions live up to the values they claim to uphold. The dark history of the largest American wartime base is not just history. It is the present. It is the future. And we are all responsible for the direction that history takes. May the Lord God bless those who have served, who are serving, and who will serve. May He grant wisdom to those who command, courage to those who execute, and peace to those who bear the scars of war. And may He guide us all toward a world where the tools of war are less and less necessary, and the instruments of peace are more and more sufficient.